So this portion of chapter 6, developing Hume's skepticism and Core's miracles, looks at whether or not God can act in history, and so that's what the kind of next two subheadings for this chapter are. So Hume's reasoning influenced not only the practice of science, but also that of historiography. And so, again, Hume may not have been the biggest impact in his day, although it was regarded as a spectacular writer. But these days, you can't take a metaphysics class without bumping into Hume. You can't talk in any college for the philosophy of, or the philosophy of religion without reading
epistemology. Hume, philosophy of religion. You talk about Hume.
Yeah.
He's big.
Yep, exactly. So this will give you ammunition for those discussions that professors love having in class, where you challenge the commonly held principles that they probably also hold. So, well, philosopher F.H. Bradley took his approach as essential to critical historiography. Ernst Troeltsch labeled this argument the principle of analogy, a principle by which events not known to happen today should not be expected to happen as happening in the past. So, is a miracle happening today? No, then we shouldn't have expected to happen back then, right? It's not a normal occurrence, so we can look back and say it probably was unlikely to happen, and so we'll just take it based on, let's say, a 95% probability that it didn't happen, because it's not happening now. So we'll give ourselves 5% and we'll be magnanimous about it. Well, nevertheless, the principle of analogy makes first century miracle reports more rather than less plausible today, as many scholars now argue. And so he's going to return to that point later, but it seems like they've been hoisted by their own petard here.
Yeah. He goes on to say that some scholars today define history in such a manner as to exclude the possibility of genuine miracles in history. All right. So in other words, by definition, there is no miracle, right? Otherwise, you're not studying history. He says, especially as applied on a popular level, however, this definition risks confusing two meanings of history. Namely, a self-limited methodology, right? We only study this with regard and call that history, right? That as history cannot pronounce judgments concerning claims of supernatural causation. So if there's a judgment, if there's a claim about supernatural causation, then we can't say that's history, right? That's something else. So that's one kind of meaning of history, right? It limits itself, and you have to push supernatural activities out of the way. The other kind of, meaning of history is history as events that actually happen, right? So you have history that says we can look at everything except supernatural events, right? Because they're not history. Versus history, another definition of history that says we can look at everything that actually happened, right? And so he says history as history might not pass judgment on whether or not an occurrence such as the resurrection was a miracle, or a theological judgment involving philosophical questions about God's existence and activities and such. But it can seek to address whether or not an event literally happened, right? So notice the distinction here. What he's suggesting is we can have history that looks at all of the events that happen, right? And you don't have to necessarily explain the event or put a meaning to the event, but it's still history by examining that particular event, right?
Right. So, we have this today, and it's plastered all over the news with, colleges teach feminist history or communistic, socialistic history. And so they look at an event like Custer's Last Stand against with the Native Americans, and they view that through the lens of class conflict, right? For communism. And so they're going to tell you all the things that happened and why it happened because of this model that they're presenting first, rather than just saying, well, Custer, heard the shot, he charged, he shouldn't have, he didn't see these other forces come up, and he ultimately lost. No, they're putting their spin on it immediately and trying to kind of direct you into a path of explanation with history to back it, rather than just saying event A happened, then event B happened.
So again, he says history as history might not pass judgment on whether or not an occurrence was a miracle, but it can seek to address whether or not an event literally happened, right? So did the event happen? Whether or not you want to call it a miracle or not, history can pass, can consider whether or not the event happened. He says if an event happened and some evidence for that event remains, it can be the subject to historical investigation, right? So that's what
Right.
he's getting at. Let's call history, let's look at history, let's do history, and history is the examination of various events. Now, what you call events and how like you said, spin the event or the metaphysical meaning of the event, maybe not. But he's going to come back and say that is part of history. But here he says maybe not, but we can at least ask questions with regard to whether or not the event happened, right?
Right.
And that is doing history.
Right, exactly. Again, the one that I bring up is always Hannibal crossing the Alps with war elephants. How? It's not possible. By all accounts, by the accounts of the time, by looking at it today, it is not possible that it happened. Although we do find evidence of, elephant skeletons and we have accounts of this happening. It's in the movie Gladiator, right? So they even make reference of the Hannibal the Terrible there. That the hero of the story is supposed to be depicted there as well. And so, it's not to have a value judgment on it, but to just say, here are some reports. And we covered this in our first introduction to Hume of what did people of the time say. And they just said, listen, sometimes we just have to report, here's what I've heard, and here's what's reported to me, and then we can go out and put our spin on it after the fact. It seems like we can do both things, but if you're doing kind of the more objective stance of your craft, then just reporting what happened and having as little value judgments in there as possible will help you then to take the next step and say, this happened as a result because of this other value judgment.